Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Tim Schumm, founder and president of Lucas James Talent Partners. Tim has been in the recruiting industry for 16 years and is a frequent speaker on topics related to talent acquisition, leadership, and how the labor market affects corporate strategy. Tim is a Chicago Crain's 40 Under 40 recipient, and his firm, Lucas James, has won several industry awards due to their rapid growth as well as innovative service model and culture. Lucas James is an on-demand RPO or recruiting process outsourcing firm, serving clients as a cost-effective, flexible alternative to utilizing the traditional staffing agency model. I've known Tim for several years now, and he always has great perspective on what is going on in the market, how things are evolving, and I invited him on to kick off the 2023 calendar year of episodes to talk about what's going on in the labor market. As I mentioned in the episode, I like to make as many of these evergreen as I can, where we're talking about basic principles and things that apply through time and across industries and disciplines. But I thought it was important, with all the uncertainty going on in the world right now, to start the year with an episode talking about what's going on, how companies are evolving their talent, what they're struggling with, and what they might be struggling with in the future, whether we've got headwinds or tailwinds, and what the future, both short and long term, is going to look like. I hope this is relevant. I took a lot out of it. Heading into the new year, it's always interesting to think about what might come up over the next 12 months. And as you do your business planning, I hope you find this episode helpful. Here is Tim Schumm. Tim Schumm, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Much appreciated. Nice seeing you.
I was excited about this one. I mean, one, I think the content's going to be really relevant. And I think you, over the course of the last few years with your business, have really had a front row seat into what's going on, not only in the economy, but just in the employer market as things have gone crazy and your business has exploded. I think it'd be great to get your insights here as we go into a new year and we're sort of continuing to sit on this weird precipice where nobody really knows which way we're going to teeter and fall. I try to make most of these episodes evergreen if I can, but this is one that I thought it would just be good to get one that was really timely because the world is in such flux. So excited, a long way of saying, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you on.
So excited to talk to you. Absolutely.
So to kick things off, I was wondering if you could just sort of walk us through the last year. What was 2022 from an employer marketplace standpoint, from a recruiting and retention standpoint? Like, what happened over the last 12 months?
I think we got to take it back even a couple years. I think 2020, for a lot of different reasons, obviously, is going to go down the history books. Like our grandchildren are going to be reading about this in school for sure, based on what had transpired. Coming out of this from an economic perspective, there's just a lot of different variables that are causing a lot of gyrations in the economy, the labor market. So if you date back to 2020, we went from a period of basically one of the lowest unemployments since the Great Depression. I think 2019, we were hovering around like 4% or so. And then basically overnight, we jumped up to about 15, 20% and even higher in certain industries. And the world kind of just stopped. And we saw the government step in with stimulus. We saw people basically staying at their homes for 6, 12, 18 months. And then coming into 2020, everything just sort of popped. We had all this pent up demand. People were spending money like crazy. All this stimulus was getting into people's hands and they were throwing money around. And it caused a lot of bubbles that we can kind of get into. To answer your question, coming into 2022, things were still pretty hot. Like the tech industry was jumping. Crypto, NFTs were kind of at all-time highs. The stock market was at an all-time high, Dow Jones, NASDAQ. And then it was really like the end of Q1 with the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And then the inflation conversation started to come into full force again. So it was about the end of March where the NASDAQ started to drop, which caused basically like an entire recession for the technology industry. But everywhere else was really, really, really hot. And when you have inflation, and we can get into this a little bit more, it's basically a direct result of a really, really, really hot market. So you saw all these industries that were hiring, they were investing for the future. That caused a lot of labor market kind of gyrations and dynamics. But March was when things kind of started to flip the script a little bit. And if you want to focus on technology, where we play a lot, things are pretty dark. You have basically a bubble that happened in the private venture capital backed technology sector. So this is basically an industry that's investing for the future. They're investing in companies that are profitable. They're investing in companies that rely essentially on capital to maintain themselves and grow for the future. And the rug that just got pulled out of all these companies. So when you can't raise capital for your next round, you're going into cash conservation mode. So a lot of the layoff activity that we've seen has been a direct reflection of the technology sector, at least up until this point. So you see on LinkedIn, there's a lot of people that have lost their jobs. You see all these big tech companies that are laying off. You see all these startups, Series A, Series B, Series C companies that are kind of laying off. But most of the other sectors up until this point have been primarily okay. We have this labor market dynamic that's very interesting. You have a lot of fear that's out in the marketplace. You have a lot of talk about a recession, but the data would show that up until like 4 months ago, we had 12 million job openings. We still have 10 million job openings. We only have 4 million unemployed Americans right now. So there's all this fear, there's all this uncertainty, there's all this inflation that's happening right now, and it really hasn't really tipped the entire market into a recession just yet. So it's been pretty interesting. I think there's a lot of fear that's going on in the economy right now for business leaders. I think that's flowing into their investments, their budgeting. But I think heading into 2023 is going to be very interesting because there's a lot of variables that are creating a lot of uncertainty right now.
Looking back again, just to keep our focus backwards, and again, COVID has been kind of a time warp. So maybe this all wasn't in the last 12 months, but it seems like it was. There was this like burnout. Languishing was a word that came out. Adam Grant wrote about it. I think it was in the New York Times. There's languishing. Then we went into this period of like hyper compensation increases. And there were some like crazy competitive numbers being thrown around, especially in different certain markets, certain industries. And then we heard like quiet quitting kind of in the fall, that people were, they were working, but they had sort of reset what work-life balance meant, and they weren't going to do more than was on their job description. Where are we now? Is the wage inflation still happening at the crazy rate, or have we flipped back to an employer market? What's the next thing to come at us? It seems like we've had 4 hiring cycles in the last year alone.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think like a lot of people don't look at the labor market as any other market. Right. I think like a lot of business leaders, HR departments, they just assume they could take the same playbook that they've used in the past and apply it to really any situation. And you're absolutely right. Like the supply and demand of talent the last year or so, last like 2 years or so, has been way out of whack. It's been a very candidate driven market. Anecdotally, you could be a software engineer, you could be a project manager, you could be a salesperson, and you're just constantly flooded with job opportunities in your inbox from folks like people on my team. So when you're in that mindset, if you put yourself in that person's shoes, like you have all the power. You're not dealing with bullshit at work. You're not dealing with a manager that's maybe not treating you with respect. You're not going to be dealing with certain policies that other opportunities are going to give you at your current company. And you could just kind of up and leave and go on to the next thing. And I think when there's such a dynamic and gap between the amount of openings that there are and the amount of available talent, you're going to create situations like quiet quitting and great resignation and things like that. I think that's starting to change quite a bit. I talked about the psychology of a recession, whether we're in one or not, people are planning for it. And I think that changes companies are doing in terms of their investment into their companies, into their people. I also think that creates a little bit of like scarcity mindset for people that have jobs right now that might be afraid to take that next opportunity and might be dealing with stuff that they might not have dealt with last year because they don't want to maybe leave and go to a new company and then maybe deal with, hey, I'm the last one in, first one out, if the company that I jump to ends up going through a layoff. And I think there's a lot of fear around that. That's basically like keeping people in their jobs right now that might otherwise leave. That wasn't the case last year.
That wasn't the case like 4 months ago. It's crazy how fast that switched. It seemed like we were going to have 100% turnover in every industry. Like everybody was just going to move spots just to get something new. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, we might be in a recession. And now suddenly the market's like frozen.
Well, the playbook we're the same age. When you and I came up, sticking at the same company for a longer period of time held a lot more weight and value on your resume when looking at new job opportunities. And the last couple of years, that all kind of went out the window. There was such a demand for certain people and certain skill sets that you had to look past that, because if you didn't get the right people on the bus, you weren't going to hit your goals, hit your budgets, and kind of move on to the growth of the next year. And I think that's where companies really had to change their strategy and get back to the wage inflation thing. They were throwing a lot of salary increases at people, sign-on bonuses, like anything to get people in the seats, they would do. And I think statistics will show that is still happening, to answer your previous question that I didn't answer before. Because there's a dynamic with the amount of openings that are out there than people, you're still going to see that a little bit. I just think it's to a lesser degree. And I just looked this up. There's still wage inflation of about 5% year over year, but the inflation rate is north of that, unfortunately. Right. So even with the wage inflation that's happening and companies having to deal with that, the people that are in the jobs making money and have to pay for stuff at their households, it's still creating kind of like a net loss, unfortunately, when you're talking about real wages.
Speaking of you and I sort of coming up during the same time, I feel like there was a big period several years ago where maybe it was coming out of the last big recession where doing more with less was kind of the catchphrase. Like there were all these layoffs and people weren't hiring to backfill those positions, or when a boss left and the work got pushed to somebody else, they would just elevate them and now they were doing the jobs of 2 or 3 people. And you just saw this happen across industries. And I think intuitively we all knew that that was not sustainable, but yet we sustained it for a decent period of time. As we look forward, like I've read some interesting articles around what's happening with the demographics of our country, specifically the United States, and how the demographic makeup of America is going to be different going forward than it was in the past. Like we are not going to have as many young people coming up as there are old people retiring. And we've been talking about baby boomers retiring forever ad nauseum, but I think it's just starting to hit. I don't know that anybody's really prepared for it. What I have in my head, sort of like what I'm worried about, is that the way that companies are doing work today is not going to be sustainable because we're just not going to have the bodies. You're already seeing strain like in the nursing profession where there aren't enough people, and the way that they're administering care is not sustainable. They can't get enough people in. Turnover's too high and the bodies they have aren't there anyway. Do you see companies evolving the way that they're doing the work? Like, are they evolving their job descriptions? Are they evolving the way work gets done in their businesses? Or are we largely sort of running towards that cliff still unprepared?
I would say for the most part, we're still kind of running towards that cliff. And it's interesting because I feel like when people hear there's a labor shortage, or we can't find the workers. We can't find the workers. We need to toss money at them. I think they're going to, hey, there's so much demand. The market is so hot. Like everybody's hiring. And that's the reason that we can't find the people. And to your point about maybe some of these macroeconomic kind of trends, labor market kind of trends that are happening, they don't look to that as much. And that's much more of a long-term trend that is affecting us now, but I think it's going to affect us more in the future. So the baby boomer generation, there are 10,000 baby boomers hitting retirement age per day. In 2020, we had 29 million baby boomers leave the workforce, which was a jump percentage-wise year over year. And I think there's some pandemic factors that are a part of that. And this is going to continue over the next 6 years, where you're going to have 75 million more individuals. There's only 170 million people in the labor market at all. And you're going to have 75 million baby boomers leave over the next 6 years. That's a huge chunk. And to your point, our generation, the generations behind us, like they weren't having babies like they were back then, right? So we don't have the amount of individuals that are kind of coming up, right? So you're going to have this supply shortage of workers for that reason alone. The next interesting point is the baby boomer generation is the largest active generation in the workforce. They also carry 56% of the entire wealth in the nation. So as they retire, as they unfortunately pass on, some of the statistics would say there's $70 to $100 trillion of wealth that are going to be passed on from the baby boomer generation, initially to their spouse, but eventually to their next of kin. So people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I think that dynamic is starting to happen now, where you're having folks that aren't in the baby boomer generation retiring and doing other things. I think this maybe starts off with, hey, mom and dad gave us $1 million. Maybe your spouse stops working. That's happening across the country. And that's going to continue to happen as $70 to $100 trillion goes into people's bank accounts out of nowhere, which really hasn't happened before, right? So you're going to have not only the baby boomer generation retiring, exiting the workforce, but you're going to have folks in other generations retiring. The other interesting fact is our immigration policy. So if you look at a chart over the last 30 years of the net migration to the US and the workers that are entering the labor force in the US, it's like an up and to the right kind of chart. When you have a booming economy, like, you need workers for that. Like, it all can't go to US citizens if we're not making more US citizens as fast as the economy is growing. So part of the reason we've had this growth over the last 30 years is our immigration policy. And this isn't to get political or anything, but for the reasons that have transpired since 2016, our immigration has gone down and down to the point where over the next 2 years, our net migration is going to be zero, really at a time where we need more workers than ever at this point, which is keeping the labor market extremely tight. And then the last point that I'll say, and I'll kind of stop there, the growth of the gig economy is very, very, very transformative. So this is allowing maybe that baby boomer to exit the W-2 kind of workforce and take on part-time work. This is allowing individuals that can maybe freelance at any stage of their career and get their personal income by way of multiple gigs or projects for multiple companies. And there's a lot of platforms out there like Upwork that allow you to do that. That wasn't there before. So people are working, their income is going into the economy. But in terms of like businesses that are looking for W-2 staff, that's going to change dramatically. Like, there's going to be less of a supply of workers for that. So back to your point of like, are companies changing their strategies? I'm starting to see it a little bit, but I think 5 years from now, like, if you don't have like a subcontractor strategy or a gig economy strategy to get the work done that you need done, whereas you used only W-2 salary workers before, you're going to be left in the dust. You're not going to be able to get that work done before, and you have to change your playbook.
My prediction is it's going to be a combination, right? We're going to have to go to new markets for talent, but we're also just going to have to fundamentally restructure the way we work, use more AI, more technology, offer a different product or design it in a different way. I just feel like the companies that actually take a hard look at how our work gets done are going to be far ahead of everybody else. That's my personal bet.
I think you're spot on. I mean, we had this trend like at the dawn of globalization, like the outsourcing industry, the business process outsourcing industry, where companies said like, hey, do we need these 3,000 call center workers in high cost of living areas in the US? Or is there another way to kind of look at that? And that industry took off, right? That industry took off for these larger organizations. Whatever it ends up being, it's got to be different than it is now, because if you're relying on W-2 salary employees, there's just not going to be enough of them if we want our economy to grow.
I've got some podcasts coming up on how to restructure the work, so we won't necessarily jump into that. But let's talk about fishing in some different ponds. Like, what percentage of employers, I know there's no way to know that specifically, but like roughly, anecdotally from your experience, what percentage of employers are starting to get creative in pulling in new talent right now from different ponds, going from different pools?
Well, I think the biggest thing that happened, I mean, there was less than like single digits of employers that were offering remote working opportunities before the pandemic. Lucas James Talent Partners, we've always been remote. Like, we were ahead of the curve there. There wasn't a lot of employers that were like above 50 employees that were doing this before, but the pandemic changed all of that. And everybody had to adopt remote working policies during and then after the pandemic. And the interesting thing about that is a lot of companies don't have remote policies. Like, they're going right back to the office. And there's a lot of reasons why you might need to do that. You might be a manufacturing company or whatever. But what you need to know is the candidate pool that you're driving from is typically going to be like a 30-mile radius of your worksite location. And let's just say you had 1,000 candidates for a particular job before the pandemic. Now you still have those 1,000 candidates. The difference is those 1,000 candidates have a lot more opportunities at their fingertips than they did before, because companies outside of their living location are offering remote opportunities where they could work. So from a micro standpoint, I think the companies needed to adopt remote working policies during the pandemic. They might have hired people outside of their city or outside of a 30-mile radius. That's going to continue. That is for sure going to continue. So what we're seeing with a lot of our clients that don't have remote working policies, they're having a lot harder time finding talent right now. It is like 10 times harder to fill a job that like is in an office than remote. And I think that's kind of the first thing is we saw companies go back to the office, have trouble finding talent, and then quickly, maybe with our advice or anecdotally just needing to, open that up back again and change their strategy because of what they were seeing in the candidate marketplace.
All right. I want to come back to that question, but I want to continue where you're going here with the virtual work. One thing that I was talking with somebody about this morning, actually, coincidentally, is how for companies that are going to virtual work, what's the differentiator between your work and somebody else's work? Because if you're doing the work in your own home, you lose the whatever your office culture was as a selling point. So how do you see companies successfully pitching themselves to candidates when it is a virtual experience?
I think it depends on the type of work that you do and then the candidate profile that you're looking for. So I came from an industry, the staffing industry, where typically you're hiring people right out of college, you're training them from scratch, they're working up within the organization, and it's high turnover, right? People end up like leaving after a little bit, right? And then you have to go find like the net new employees, from the college ranks essentially. And, for a company like that, I would not recommend a remote environment. To your point, like you're losing a lot of that camaraderie that especially that candidate profile probably needs leaving the college environment and entering the workforce, those training opportunities, those collaboration opportunities. I can even talk about myself back then, right? Like work was my life. Like I didn't have any kids. I wasn't married back then. A lot of my friends were at work. Like my identity was very much tied to the work environment, frankly, if I'm being honest. And then I'll just continue to talk about myself as I grew, as I got married, as I had kids, as my interests changed. I knew that I could get the same amount of work done at home. So at my company now, our average age is probably like 30s, 40s, people with families, right? They're focused on other things outside of what I described before. This is a very attractive environment for them as opposed to being in an office. So I think that's the first thing is you have to really like truly understand what your candidate profile is. And that actually might be different per department, right? You might have maybe a flexible policy for, I don't know, the software engineers, but you need the call center folks in the office, or you need the SDRs and the entry level sales folks kind of in the office. And I think you need to be very intentional about that. And then once that's said, then you need to speak to that. Because if you're putting yourself in the candidate shoes and saying, all right, if I'm this candidate based on the profile that I just mentioned, what would I want out of my work experience? Then you need to kind of create that work experience, whether it's virtual or in an office, kind of based off of that. So I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that's interesting thinking about having different policies, even just for different departments.
Probably pretty controversial. It's causing a lot of issues right now. It's causing a lot of issues.
It would make sense if your departments have drastically different demographics, because they're going to have drastically different needs and you're going to have drastically different needs from them. Going back to the earlier question about fishing in some different ponds, like how do you see companies getting creative as far as going into talent pools that maybe they wouldn't have considered before, and I'll say repurposing talent or training talent in a different way or using their skills in a different way? Do you have any stories or any best practices on how companies are starting to do that?
The first thing that comes to mind is upskilling of employees. So we've seen anecdotally larger technology companies have a need for mid-level, senior level software engineers, and they spend a lot of money on recruitment to try to steal from someone else's company that talent to kind of get them over to their organization. But the reality is like the labor market statistics are not in their favor, and that's going to be really, really hard to do. But if you hire entry-level talent and then you have investment on really, really, really good training programs to kind of get that skills gap to where it needs to be, that could be a solution that a lot of companies are doing right now. And I think that they should be doing. When you're a smaller organization, if you're a startup, if you're 50 employees, even like 500 employees, it's just a lot easier to just invest more in your recruitment strategy to just get the talent that you need. But these larger organizations have major, major labor problems that they're going to have to deal with. And these trends aren't going backwards. They're just going forwards at a rapid pace.
Do you see companies investing more in learning and development right now? Because that's always been an area that has not gotten investment. And especially with the potential of heading into a recession, that's an area that gets cut quickly.
Right now, no, no. I've always said this, and I think you can appreciate this with your clients. Like, human resources is the most underinvested in, underappreciated. Like, they have to act in a reactionary manner to what's going on in the business. And it's really hard for them to accomplish things that take like 2, 3, 4 years, like learning and development and things like that. So a lot of those things get squashed when really they shouldn't be, right? If like HR was 100% aligned with the CFO and the CEO strategy all the time, I think you'd see a lot more learning and development opportunities. And how do we retain the talent we have and how do we upskill them into the future rather than just being on this hamster wheel of growth and then, okay, how do we go find the people? So I don't see that. And I think that's a shame, but I think that's what a lot of companies should be doing is like stay focused on keeping the people that you have, like create a really good working environment, treat them right, treat them with respect, give them promotional opportunities and help them get there through learning and development. I don't see that happening as much as it should be. But yeah, man, like the first sign of a recession, what's the first thing that gets cut? Some of those ancillary things that like don't really help the bottom line tomorrow, unfortunately.
Yeah. Training goes out the window so early.
Totally. But I think that's a strategy, and that's what keeps people. Like if your company, if your manager's like investing into your future, you're more likely to stay. You're more likely to have loyalty to that employer versus like just talk about labor market dynamics and hey, I have a lot of other job opportunities in the first sign of adversity. I'm just going to go bounce for, $5K more, right? I think the company should have that flipped.
Yeah. I have talked on here about my philosophy on the hierarchy of employee needs. And I think it starts with basic rewards. They're the physiological level. You got to get your pay, you got to get your benefits just to make sure that you can fund some kind of life that you're proud of and protect yourself when things go bad. The next one is leadership, because without leadership, everything else falls down. So I think leadership's the next. And then after that, it's mastery. Like I like Daniel Pink's mastery, autonomy, and connectedness. I think he said purpose, but his sense changed it to connectedness. Like what really motivates us is trying to get better at something, being given some autonomy over our actions as we gain skill, and then connecting with others, connecting with the higher purpose of our business, connecting with our teammates, just feeling like part of something as a human being. And to your point, we all aspire to be better at what we're doing. We all aspire to mastery, maybe not to be the number one in the world. We all want to get better. And that if we can give people that, it just creates all kinds of loyalty and trust if we can show them that we're helping them become better human beings and, better at whatever that craft is.
Totally. I mean, I've been in the recruiting industry a long time. Like I've seen, I don't know, thousands of companies and how they operate and what their cultures are like and how they treat people. And I think for the most part, companies just have it wrong. Like everything's 80-20. I think right now it's 80%. Hit your number. What did you do? Did you have a good quarter, bad quarter? Did you have a good day, bad day? What's your plan for the future? Like, hey, you did this wrong. Like pick it up, performance plan, boom, 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 boom. And then it's like 20%. Hey, nice job. Let's talk about your career mapping. Like, let's invest in your future. Let me like coach you on how to get there. And I think I wouldn't want to work in an environment like that. Like, hell no, that would suck. I have before. And it's almost like there's these institutions that are just institutionalized around this culture and this like top-down kind of thought processes. And at least here, like, I don't know if I'm doing this right or not, but I'd like to think we're doing it 80-20 the other way, where it's like, hey, we're going to create a framework. We're going to give you some freedom within that framework. We're going to give you all the tools and resources to do your job. We're going to have incentive-based compensation. So the opportunity is there for you. And then we're going to grow. We're going to career map. We're going to create these opportunities for you in the future. We're going to talk about what that is and be honest with you about what your shortcomings are. But you're going to come in with owed respect based on where you came from, what you did in the past. You're a human being. And then you're going to get earned respect over time based on what you do here. And then there's 20% like, hey, you got to lay the hammer down every once in a while when folks like aren't fitting what we're trying to do here and, have those conversations. But I think in general, if you can lead like that, if you can manage like that, and if you can create a culture around that, people are probably going to stay a little bit more. And I read Glassdoor reviews ad nauseum. Like every client, every prospect that we take on, I read their Glassdoor reviews, and it's a survey site. so that you're always going to get some like out of whack, 1 out of 10 people on there, but you can see a trend of what's going on. And I think this is very common at most organizations, is this like top-down leadership putting people in a box, and people don't want to be in a box. They're humans. They want more out of life, and they spend a lot of time at work. And I think if you create that environment that's going to foster that growth, they're probably not going to leave, and they're probably going to be better next year than they are this year, and better 3 years from now than they are today.
Yeah. The continuation of my sort of thoughts around the future of work and redesigning work is based on human-centered design. I think we need to redesign how the work gets done so we can be more efficient and effective. But the other side of that coin is designing work that people want to do. Just like we design a product for the user experience, I think we need to be paying attention to the user experience when they show up in the office or sign on virtually.
Totally. I mean, let's be honest, like human capital, like humans are an input into a machine, an enterprise, like an entity that's supposed to chip out profit. Like this is how our society is basically developed. But if you focus on the individuals, I do feel, to your point, you're going to get more out of those individuals, and that's going to be better for the enterprise. And I think that's a huge miss. And I think you're right in the future. Like you have to adapt to that.
Are there any other signals or trends that you're paying attention to in the world? You've talked about a bunch, but is there anything else that you're maybe paying attention to that you think could be a sneaky influence on the world?
I think, it's going to be really, I don't know if this is like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 40 years from now, but, at some point, like what I do, I feel like is going to look a lot different. If you think about it, most people find a job through recruiter or through like a referral, like somebody that they know. And like most things that you purchase or engage with, there's an online marketplace. There's a data algorithm to show like what your interests are, what the product offers to make like the most appropriate match. And this is still like Stone Age kind of stuff in the recruitment market. Your job, your occupation, the company that you work for is such a big, important piece of your life. And the fact that you're making that decision because a recruiter reaches out, or like your buddy or your neighbor makes an introduction for you, like that seems crazy, right? Like every other area of life, there's like the internet's kind of taken over, and the internet's made automation has made recruitment more efficient and made that connection a little bit more efficient. But I think that's going to be a huge change once AI kind of takes over. And I don't know if it's going to be LinkedIn, but somebody's going to do a really good job, to your point, of categorizing O'Brien and categorizing Tim, not just based on like a resume, but my interests, what I want to do, the type of people that I would engage with best. I don't know, personality profiles compared to maybe the manager that I would work for, algorithmically categorize what culture I would foster the most growth in. And then kind of cross-reference that with other data based on companies that aren't just like industry size revenue right now. Like those are like the main things right now. But to your point, that like human dynamic, that cultural dynamic, and making those connections over time, it fascinates me. I'm scared the hell out of it. I hopefully I'm well out of the industry once that takes over, but that's something I spend a little bit of mental energy towards. That's going to be fascinating, I think, in the future.
I see it now. Tinder for recruiting.
Look at that. Swipe right, swipe left.
There you go.
I married my college sweetheart, so I don't have any experience there. But
I missed that trend as well.
Something's going to change for sure.
Yeah, that's funny. I think Tinder popped off maybe 2 years after I met my wife.
Gotcha.
So I borrowed a friend's phone one time and had some fun going through his account, setting him up with people. So I've used it once for somebody else.
You're a matchmaker. Perfect.
It is a sort of an addictive technology. Is there anything else we haven't covered that you think would be good to cover for HR or business leaders as we head into a new year?
I think, this time of year, your podcast is probably going to come out, I would imagine January, right? Like budgets are being set. There's planning going on for 2023, where the investment's going to be made. I think business leaders, and HR included, are having a tough time with that right now. There's so many different variables of uncertainty. You have pundits that are calling for a soft landing where there's going to be no recession. Inflation is going to come down. The Federal Reserve is going to chill out on interest rates, and things are going to be quiet for a while, but we're going to go back to our next growth cycle. And then you have folks that are basically saying like, hey, we have not hit the end of this 10-year bull run yet, and we haven't flushed everything out. And 2023 is going to be the year to do that. And that's just a really tough environment to be operating in as a business leader. I can speak from experience. So when companies are engaging like that, I would, as an employee at a company or as a job seeker, I would be very cautious, like heading into 2023 with some of the decisions that were being made. And you cannot follow the 2021, early 2022 playbook with all this uncertainty that's going on. I think the silver lining is this will pass. The recession, the dot-com 2.0 bust in the technology industry has been going on for 9 months now. It's going to subside at some point. We will get back to a growth cycle. Things will be fine, but it might be rocky for a little bit. So I would just encourage everybody, whether you're a business leader that's going through planning for next year, maybe a laid off worker that just got laid off and you're kind of down on yourself right now, or somebody that's concerned about their job in 2023, that this will be short term. It'll pass. Like we've gone through these cycles before. We'll be out on the growth cycle again, but we're going to be operating in a very uncertain environment headed into 2023. And it'll be interesting if nothing else.
Yeah. And for anybody who's kind of nodding along as Tim is saying that, I did an episode with a woman named Rebecca Ryan, who's a professional futurist. And she talks about how to plan for different possible futures. And the thing I really took away from her conversation was it's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding what the possible futures could be and then having plans for those so that you can adapt to them as they start to unfold, which I thought was a much better way of planning. You know, hey, here's the 3 or 4 ways the next year could go. We've got 3 or 4 plans in place. And then as we start to see these different things happen in the world or in our business, you know, then we can start to filter through which of these plans make sense and which don't. So for anybody who is nodding along, that's a great episode. And she is a brilliant futurist.
I love that. I love that.
Tim, thank you for coming on here. Would you mind just sharing, I know you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but would you mind sharing a little bit about Lucas James Talent Partners and what you do and where people can find you if they are interested in continuing the conversation or getting some help?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've been in the recruiting industry for 16 years. I did over a decade at a traditional staffing and recruitment firm. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners are HR business leaders. You probably worked with a recruiter before. They charge 20, 25, 30% of first year salary, super expensive. That's kind of where I came from. So I started Lucas James in 2018, 4.5 years ago, to be an alternative to that entire engagement model, right? So the way that we're set up, we have a team of mid-level, senior level, full life cycle recruiters, and we bill our resources out on a hourly basis to act as an extension of our clients' HR talent acquisition teams. Or for smaller businesses or startups, we essentially play the talent acquisition function. And because we charge on an hourly basis versus a per head 20 to 30% fee, we end up driving that cost per hire down significantly. So over the 4 years, we've made 4,000 placements at an average cost of 9% versus 20 to 30% for our clients. We work with a lot of different companies, shapes and sizes, a lot of different industries. We provide bandwidth to our clients' talent acquisition function. So yeah, reach out if you're looking on planning for next year. You want to keep things lean and flexible. That's essentially what we're doing for our HR clients.
Awesome. And I will put your company and how to contact you in the show notes. And for anybody who's interested, they can reach out there. Tim, this is great. I'm excited to post this to start off 2023. And I think it'll be valuable, especially with all the uncertainty that you've talked about. So thank you and Happy New Year and all the best in 2023 to you and everybody listening.
Thanks, O'Brien. Happy New Year, everybody.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.